who was Theodore Geisel and why was he trying to kill Dick and Jane?
So Theodore Geisel was also known as Dr. Seuss. And in 1954, I think it's 1954, there's a famous article that came out in Life magazine by a journalist named John Herschel. And Herschel was noting that American school children were not learning to read as quickly as other kids around the world, notably their Soviet counterparts. And he was arguing that the reason they didn't learn to read quicker is because all the reading primers at that point were super boring. As Jack and Jill went up a hill, there was just nothing interesting about them. And in that article, he mentioned, how come we can't get some of America's great children's illustrators like Walt Disney or Dr. Seuss to go off and write children's books? Well, Dr. Seuss's editor saw that. Dr. Seuss's editor at Random House saw that article, and he went to Ted and he said, hey, do you think you could do a book, to teach second graders how to read? And Ted said, yeah, sure. That sounds like an interesting project. And so then they said, okay, well, here's the list of 200, I think it was 220 words that a second grader should know. The most complicated word on the list, I believe, was together, maybe mother, but everything else is like, about and end and cat and things like that. And so he gets this list of, I think it was, again, like around 220 words. He thinks that he's going to whip up this book in a matter of months. His other books would typically take a year, but he thought this was going to be a super simple project. Months go by. He doesn't have any ideas. Like, he's just getting really frustrated. And at some point he just says, I'm going to look at the list, and the first two words that I can rhyme, I'm just going to figure out the story from that. And he comes across cat and hat. He accepts that constraint. These are the words. I can do a story with the first two things that rhyme, cat and hat. Okay, I'm going to make a story with that. And of course, he goes on to create Cat and Hat. It's enormously successful, spawns an entire different line of books for Random House, which is the beginner books, which are the smaller Dr. Seuss books that we all, teach our kids to read with. The Cat and Hat's one of them. Go Dog Go, who was actually written by P.D. Eastman, is another in that line. Mr. Brown Can Moo. There's many others in that line that they're about kids learning to read. And of course, Cat in the Hat is financially successful for him. He buys a beautiful house out in San Diego, and the rest is magic. But, I always come back to, he accepted the constraints. I mean, you could sort of like sit around there and say, well, could we throw in a couple of extra words? Could I invent some words, which is what he kind of famously did, inventing words like nerd and Lorax and many others. He invented many words. But with Cat in the Hat, it's like, no, I'm going to stick to this thing. And then as I mentioned in the talk, like, Cat in the Hat's arguably a rather subversive book, because it's about two young kids getting into all this trouble while their mom's away. And you have to remember the context. This is the mid to late 50s when, children were seen and not heard. And society is very, in the Western world, very uptight and very hierarchical and very misogynistic. And so, the kids, the mom goes away, the kids get into all this trouble with the cat, but the cat's like, man, don't stress. We'll clean everything up. It'll be spick and span by the time mom gets home. She doesn't really need to know. Today, we might sort of laugh about it, but, in the 1950s, it's a pretty subversive idea, actually.
It actually sounds like an analogy for remote work.
Maybe so. Like, the boss doesn't really need to know. Like, the hierarchical authorities maybe don't need to know everything that's going on.
Are you saying that I didn't need to make this bed up behind me before we recorded?
You didn't for me. Yeah, Dr. Seuss, constraints, man. Love them. I mean, when he wrote, I think it was Green Eggs and Ham was actually written on a bet with a buddy that he could write a book using, I think it was less than 80 words, something like that. And so it was just that one. By then, like, he's kind of leaning into the constraints. He's like, oh, it's actually kind of interesting to take this limited vocabulary and try to make a children's book out of it. That's actually an interesting, fun, technical writing problem. So he sort of like leaned into the constraints. And I think as designers in software, we're often like, well, do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? At some point, you kind of have to settle into it and sort of say, okay, these are the constraints. Maybe it's a constraint of time. Maybe it's a constraint of resources. Maybe it's requirements. Like, there's all sorts of different types of constraints. But, if you just accept the constraints, it's actually really liberating, because it takes a lot of options and optionality and, procrastination ideas. It takes all that crap out of your head and says, okay, this is the problem. And it can be very centering and very focusing if you'll lean into it and embrace it